Happy Tuesday. Here we go. All right, I'm going to try to do this in an efficient way. We're talking about the expansion of the Empire of Japan today. This is Mr. Osborne, Fairview High School. So let's go ahead and start, and here we go. So as you recall, whenever we talked about Japan as kind of a case study for imperialism and industrialization, they had a rapid advancement due to what is known as the Meiji Restoration. Within about 30 years, Japan had caught up with the West, and they were ready to start flexing their muscle. One of the first, targets, places they wanted to go was essentially the Korean Peninsula. Unfortunately, the Chinese were already there, which is what led to the First Sino-Japanese War of 1895. And this is when Japan kind of gained its international notoriety because it defeated a much smaller country in the traditional Western mindset of Japan, defeated this imperial historical giant of China. So Japan defeats China in Korea and Manchuria, and it annexed the island of Formosa. This is also known as Taiwan. After the war, though, Japan mostly just consolidated its power in Korea, and Russia took back control of Manchuria, simply on the grounds of they were European and therefore were more powerful, and they didn't like Japan invading their sphere of influence in northeast China. The Russo-Japanese War followed about 10 years later, 1904 to 1905, and it's one of those things where the Japanese didn't forget what the Russians did to kind of disrespect them. And so Japan defeats Russia, and that actually has a trickle-down, kind of domino impact on Russia because it is one of the contributing factors to the Russian Revolution. And so at that point, Japan really just solidifies its control over the Korean Peninsula and kind of turns northeast China into a Japanese sphere of influence. 1910, Japan officially annexes Korea. And this is kind of the last of their expansion in the kind of the early phase. Okay, and so the whole peninsula, the whole entire Korean peninsula becomes a Japanese protectorate. It is essentially established as a sub-territory of the Empire of Japan. Leading up to World War I, Japan starts embracing kind of this international dynamic. They basically wanted to be the equivalent of the European imperial powers in Asia. But they weren't fully respected. Yes, they had defeated Russia, but they were not yet in the international mindset on the same footing. You guys did the reading yesterday that was assigned about how the Japanese, one of the scholars of the time, felt that that the white men of Europe, still looked down upon the non-whites, and Japan wanted to be the number one non-white empire in the world. Okay. During World War I, Japan chose the side of the Allies. So they fought against Germany. They took over all of Germany's kind of Asian land holdings, and in China, specifically the Qingdao Peninsula. And they also used their navy to support the Allied navies in the Mediterranean. They did not, however, put any soldiers or boots on the ground to fight in Europe, which is probably why they were not respected in the peace process. So they were not represented in the Treaty of Versailles. They didn't get any spoils of war, even though they were clearly against Germany during the entire conflict. As far as democratization goes, there was an increase, a surge, because one of the ways we know that in the year 1919, all men, not just the wealthy, land-owning, tax-paying class, they all gained the vote. During the 1920s, Japan benefited along with the rest of the world as far as the growth of the economy. There's kind of this time of peace for about 10 years, and they joined the League of Nations. They were advocates for world peace. They didn't have any conquest during this time, and they were just kind of developing their internal democracy and their parliamentary system. However, 1929 happens, and the Great Depression hits, and that actually impacts the entire world. Most scholars estimate about 15% of global production was reduced. So they lost 15% all the countries across the world altogether lost about 15% of their production and their economies. For comparison's sake, in 2008, during the financial crisis, we all remember how much that impacted us in the United States. That was only a 1% reduction. So 15 times that amount. It's a pretty big deal. Japan specifically lost about 8% of their economy, their production, which is still 8 times worse than the Great Recession, 2008. But they were one of the first countries to adopt what we know today as Keynesian economics. Keynes did not publish his ideas until 1936, and so Japan technically adopted them before they officially existed, but the theory was still there, and they basically ramped up debt spending. And what did they spend that money on? The military. So the military is kind of their bailout function. So surprise, surprise, they kind of follow the same path as Mussolini and Hitler as far as building up their military during the time of economic crisis. This was highly successful, and Japan essentially was fully recovered by 1934. With that newfound kind of surge in militarism, because once you start funding the military, then the military gains more power, they began another round of expansion in the 30s. The first destination was again that northeast China, that Manchuria region, and well, they invaded in 1931. They kind of created a puppet state known as Manchukuo in 1934. And so it was a complete puppet state. There was no independence at all. They put the last Chinese emperor that had been kicked out about 30 years prior from China. And so his name was Puyi, and so he was the child emperor, the last one of China. They put him on the throne of Manchuria. But again, they had no power, and it was just a giant coal and iron resource mine shaft, if you will, for the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. So this leads us a few years later to the Marco Polo Bridge incident. This is the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. So it starts on July 7th, 1937. It was just a small skirmish. There wasn't necessarily a planned aggression. They didn't fully invade China, but this aggression built and built, and there was a battle, and Japan used it as an excuse to kind of to surge up and reinforce the military in China. And within 6 months, they had conquered Beijing, the major city in the north, Nanjing, the national capital, and Shanghai, the major city in the east. And so they took out all those main positions of power within 6 months. It was highly effective. The kind of thing I want to end on, because that leads us basically right up to World War II. You can almost argue that World War II in Asia started in 1937, is something that's known as the Nanjing Massacre. Nanjing, Nanking, same thing, spelled the same way in Chinese, spelled the same way in Japanese. And Japan conquers the capital. Okay, capital city of China, the Republic of China, December in 1937. The population had surged to about 1 million because people were trying to run away from the Japanese, and they thought hiding in the capital city was the most effective place or safest place to hide. Unfortunately, once the Japanese took control and the nationalist government left, they closed the city gates, and they perpetrated one of the greatest war crimes during World War II, and it's known as the Nanjing Massacre. Sometimes it's referred to as the Rape of Nanjing or the Rape of Nanking. It's the same event. Lasts about 8 weeks. It starts day one, once they take control in December 13th, and it goes on for 2 months. Most historians argue that about 300,000 civilians died during the massacre. So that's 1 in 3 of the people left in the city after the military leaves. They were all civilian deaths. There were no active military resistance within the city. They had city walls, they closed the gates, and they, for the next 2 months, committed widespread violence, rape, looting. There are competitions between commanders who could decapitate the most with people without dulling the swords. There were, I will not show images of this event because it is too egregious to show. Okay. Those that were active and responsible in the Nanjing Massacre were tried for war crimes. Not the best way to end this presentation, But what I wanted to go through essentially is, Japan rose to power in the 1930s on the global stage, and there was nothing really stopping them from expanding all over Asia, with kind of two exceptions. You had a resource squeeze. It required oil and fuel in order to get to provide the energy needed for their navies. There was a manpower need because you can only invade so far without stretching your troops too thin, and you come up against other players such as China and the various European and American powers that were elsewhere in Southeast Asia. To be continued next week.